The Seattle Police Department needs hundreds more officers, and now it's offering up to $15,000 in signing bonuses to new recruits and officers who transfer here. Will the incentive program pay off?
We want to make sure that we're competitive with other organizations.
So when are you going to come join us?
The SPD is fanning out across the country to try to replenish its ranks. But it's also trying a new approach to attract experienced candidates and those from historically underrepresented communities.
I'm very happy to sign this legislation.
But negative perceptions about police and the SPD's federal consent decree continue to present challenges.
Change is hard.
Will the state's highest paid police force now be able to attract the best talent?
We absolutely have to have a police force that represents the people that we serve.
Our studio panel weighs in.
I think this is a national issue.
Going behind the badge, next on City Inside Out. Welcome to this edition of City Inside Out. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. The City Council has just approved a measure to give a financial bonus to officers who take a job with the Seattle Police Department. It's $7,500 for new recruits and $15,000 for officers transferring in, a deal similar to what other departments offer in our region and nationwide. But the dilemma behind the dollars is troubling, as the SPD, again, like other departments nationwide, is trying to boost the declining number of job seekers signing up to be cops. The reasons why that's happening in Seattle, from the economy to labor issues to a changing public perception of law enforcement, make this as much a story about renewing confidence within the SPD's current ranks as it is about bringing new officers on board.
You guys enjoying the show?
With 29 years of service as a Seattle police officer, Detective Kerry Mcnalley has a love for her job that's simply part of who she is.
We want to make sure that we're bringing in new people all the time.
Yet as a recruiter for the SPD at job fairs like this one, and dozens more outreach events year-round, getting others to love this work as much as she does is her biggest challenge.
In 2018, we saw a pretty big shift. We lost about 30% of our entry-level candidates.
This really paints the picture.
SPD figures show the number of new officers signing on dropped significantly last year, and lateral transfers coming in from other departments fell even further by 48%.
Well, we are looking for police officers.
This has happened despite the same amount of recruiting outreach and advertising from the SPD, leaving Detective McNally to face a difficult, multifaceted problem.
We want to be very honest about this. It's not always easy.
Beyond economic factors like Seattle's booming job market, the SPD, like many police agencies having hiring issues nationwide, is dealing with a public relations puzzle. McNally says people are seeing officer-involved shootings, labor struggles, criticisms from some city leaders, and concerns over federally mandated police reform, rather than the positive work of the SPD.
So when are you going to come join us?
The impact of those public perceptions lands on the 1,300-plus officers of the SPD, who McNally says are her best recruiters. She says if they don't feel supported, they won't support her efforts either.
And that's where we're going to lose those new candidates, because if those officers aren't talking about how great it is here, we're potentially losing those candidates to other local agencies.
So I'm now very proud to be able to sign this legislation.
The city of Seattle is trying to tackle the problem with a new policy to keep up with other local police agencies that offer signing bonuses.
I think it just makes us more competitive.
New Seattle recruits will get $7,500 for signing on. Transfers from other departments, $15,000. Half of that amount would go on an officer's first paycheck after they're hired, the second half after a year's probation. And the bonus would need to be refunded if officers left before the 3-year mark.
I really think at the end of the day, money factors into many things.
Reverend Harriet Walton, co-founder of Mothers for Police Accountability, has worked on police reform for nearly 30 years, and she supports the new police hiring incentives.
This is a good use of our tax dollars right now.
She is strongly urging the SPD toward hiring lateral officers who haven't been involved in shootings, and overall, building a racially diverse workforce that's on board with the idea of police reform.
We need people who actually believe in good constitutional policing at the end of the day. Your job is to apprehend and to arrest, and that's it.
Is it just you two in here right now?
Yeah.
Do you mind if we come in and talk to you then?
Seattle police say they're committed to federally compliant policing, bolstered by the passage of I-940.
Officer Dawson, can I talk to you for a minute?
To improve de-escalation training like this for officers statewide.
There's been some ebb and flow. Every time there's a shooting, you go ebb and flow.
Walden believes police accountability and police recruiting can both improve in the years ahead, but only with a genuine, transparent relationship between the SPD and the greater Seattle community.
We're constantly building a bridge. You don't take your marbles and go home. You stay at the table.
It's about 6 months to get through the entire process.
Detective McNally will stay at the table as long as she has to find new recruits.
Send me an email and I will connect you with an officer that you can do right along with.
Her end goal, shared by city leaders working on new signing bonuses and community advocates, is to move past the challenges of public perception toward a renewed focus on public safety.
My officers mean everything to me, and I want them to be safe, and we want to bring more people on here that can protect each other and our community. And if we don't have those numbers, then it starts becoming unsafe.
The thin blue line getting a little too thin in Seattle as we talk about recruiting here with Councilmember Lorena González, who chairs the Council's Public Safety Committee, who also worked to create this new signing bonus legislation. Good to have you, Councilmember.
Thank you.
We also have with us Mike Fields. He is Executive Director of Human Resources, I should say, for the Seattle Police Department. Mike, good to have you too.
Hello.
And joining us on the phone, we have Fe Lopez. She is Director for the Community Police Commission, which provides community input on reforms at the SPD. Fe, good to have you too.
Hello. Hi.
All right, there she is. I'm going to start this with a question, if we could, just a broad question. What impact do you think a signing bonus like this will have on recruitment for the SPD? Councilmember González, I'll start with you. What are you and the council trying to accomplish working on this with the mayor and SPD?
Well, I think it's really simple. I think what we have heard from the police department and what we have seen in the data that they have provided us is that they are setting goals for hiring and recruitment that they aren't able to meet and achieve. And what we know is that in this region, there are cities that we compete with directly, that the department competes with directly for employment, that are offering hiring bonuses to laterals in particular. And so it's important for us to make sure that we are competitive within this market, and really at its core, this legislation was designed to level that playing field and to give the Seattle Police Department the tools they need to be able to be competitive in an environment where it's hard to recruit nationally.
It certainly can be. And Mike, just to dovetail off that, other law enforcement agencies, Bellevue, Everett PD, just to name a few here, they offer some of these bonuses. Seattle really is trying to compete for talent in a growing job market, not just with law enforcement, a lot of different opportunities for smart people out there. What do you hope comes out of this plan to offer bonuses? Why is it important to the SPD?
Sure, we're experiencing something of a perfect storm in our sworn hiring of low unemployment regionally, nationally, et cetera, a challenging job market with other jurisdictions in this area and nationally. Other jurisdictions are adding sworn officers as we are seeking to do. And then a demographic bubble that is arising from the fact we hired a lot of folks in the mid-'80s and who are now ready to retire. So those things taken together really make it important that we remain competitive for new talent.
Okay, great. And Faye, I'll bring you in here. I know the CPC has been critical of the city over the last few months regarding this ongoing work towards police accountability and the recent police union contract. I'm looking at the signing bonus. Is it a step in the right direction, or how do you look at this?
So under the consent decree, the Seattle Community Police Commission was charged with doing community engagement evaluations, assessments. And one of the major pieces that came out of community, particularly the racial, ethnic, and immigrant communities, was hiring of officers. That was a huge issue and concern. So therefore, this Community Police Commission did a 2016 assessment in this area on racial, ethnic, immigrant communities, and then also issued a report on recommendations. And we talked to several folks within the racial, ethnic, and immigrant communities and SPD, new officers all the way to management, those who do the work in recruitment, hiring, and training. And bottom line, the major purpose and reason why it was so important was to improve relationships within the communities and decrease negative interactions between certain communities that are most impacted by negative policing. And one of the mayor's promises was that the bonuses would be used in part to attract officers from historically underrepresented groups. It will only make a difference if coupled with other initiatives such as ongoing training and implicit bias, bias-free policing, community engagement, youth crisis intervention, and other hiring preferences like language and background, and then mentorship. So those are things that are really important not to lose sight of when thinking about hiring.
Thank you. And we're going to pick apart some of those issues as we go through the show here. But Lorena, I want to make sure I jump in on this point. You heard Detective McNally in our setup piece voice her concerns about public perception of police officers with regard to officer shootings, for example, the federal consent decree process the SPD is going through to change how officers use force. She says current officers, her best recruiters she calls them, can get lumped in with some negative perceptions that can impact bringing in new cops. Do you think this legislation will affect that larger issue of changing public perception of the SPD, police in general?
I'm not sure that you know, money and a bonus is what is going to fix those issues. And so I think really what we need to keep in sight is that this bonus is one small tool that is specifically designed to help the Seattle Police Department address some short-term recruitment issues that they're experiencing as a result of the perfect storm described by Mike. And I do think it's important to make sure that all of the equity values that that Director Lopez described in her response are layered on top of SPD's hiring practices. I mean, I think around the public perception, I think this is a national issue. We are seeing across the country in increased amount of public attention to officer-involved shootings. And as a person who comes from a community of color that tends to be over-policed, we know that this is an issue that's been happening within our communities and that our communities have been feeling for a long period of time. And so the fact that they're getting more media attention is what is making it more more prevalent in terms of the everyday talk of people at the dinner table. And it's a reality that there is a issue in this space and that we are all collectively struggling with it. The question is how do we want to struggle with figuring out the solutions to that? And in my mind, it's important for us to have recruits from communities that are over-policed, that are historically over-policed, be part of the department to begin that hard work of developing trust with communities that have had historically negative interactions.
And Mike, I want to make sure I air out this piece because the SPD has been studying this. Rich O'Neill, longtime leader at the Seattle Police Officers Guild, mentioned in a recent interview that reforms from the consent decree have been harmful for recruiting at the SPD. How do you respond to that?
So we've been under a consent decree since 2012. We had our 3 best years of recruiting, 3 best consecutive years in department history, actually, in 2015, 16, and 17. So I think people's reasons for joining the department and leaving the department are many and varied. And so I'm not sure you can draw that correlation.
There were some exit interviews, too, that I know the SPD has done with that, that has talked about that,
I mean, listen, anytime we lose someone to another department, for example, lose a good person to another department, that's one too many. So we want to know why and what and how and what we can do better, so we take a look at that. But back to your point, I just couldn't draw that correlation, having been under a consent decree for the last 7 years and having experienced very good hiring during that time period.
Just to take it a bit further, how do you think a plan like this to offer bonuses to new recruits, what impact will that have on current officers right now in the SPD, do you think? How will it impact morale, do you think?
Well, officers across the department are interested in full staffing. I think everyone involved in this topic is interested in full staffing. That impacts how much overtime folks have to work, that impacts safety, et cetera. And so the feedback I've received is positive and seen as one piece of the puzzle towards leading to full staffing.
And we're going to talk more about the other piece of that puzzle too in just a little bit. But Faye, I wanted to make sure I ask this question of you too. Do you have any concerns that the consent decree, which the CPC has played a very important role in, might be having a chilling impact on recruiting? What do you think?
No, I agree with Mike. I mean, this is a national problem. If you look at Atlanta PD, they have 400 vacant positions. If you look at Honolulu, Hawaii, they have 250 vacant positions. This is a national problem. Both of those cities are not under consent decree. We are experiencing low unemployment rates, and there are a lot of factors that go into hiring issues. And so I do agree with Mike on that.
Okay, thanks for helping me air that one out. Lorena, let's talk a little bit more about creating this racially diverse police department, why that's important. How will this bonus program help in that effort, and what other criteria will be used to attract officers of color?
Well, you know, I think I have heard pretty loudly and clearly from both the department and community that they want to see their communities represented in the workforce of the Seattle Police Department. And that's I think a continued commitment, and I think that commitment has borne out in some of the results that we have seen from the police department in terms of a really significant increase in the number of self-identified people of color who are becoming police officers. So that's a very good trend. We want to continue to see that. Part of my motivation in offering a $7,500 bonus to new recruits was specifically because that's where we're seeing a lot of that diversity come from. And I don't want to compromise the police department's good progress in the space of diverse recruitment at the expense of just focusing on lateral hires. So I believe that we'll continue to see good progress there, and I have heard very clearly from the department that they continue to be committed to focus on recruiting from those communities. And in fact, many of the outreach programs that they do and the career fairs that they do are within diverse communities that are guided by diverse communities' input.
And also, there are some bonus points, as I understand it, for people who speak second languages. Can you help me with that small piece, please?
Yeah, we're really excited about this piece. So over the last year and a half or so, Councilmember Herbold and I have been working together with other folks around developing a modification to preference points, what are referred to as preference points. Currently, under state law, preference points are only permitted for prior military service. There is an opportunity to layer on additional preference points to be able to reward other characteristics that are also contributing positively to this work. And so some of those things are language, and language, for example, is an important one, which you heard Fed talk about. And the Community Police Commission has done a lot of work in this area and has really been the driving force behind making sure that those preference points are being reflective of some of the other skill sets that I think are important to recruitment efforts and the characteristics we expect of our officers.
And Mike, I think it's important to point out that while recruiting numbers are low right now for the SPD, racial diversity of overall SPD hires has actually increased. 14% in 2013, up to 36% in 2018, some progress there. But I'm looking at this bonus program and I'm trying to see how it could help keep officers of color in place, because I know there have been some situations where officers of color have had to drop out, some concerns there. I'm wondering if this bonus program will help hire and maybe keep more people on the force.
So I would see the bonus program being in addition to our current efforts. It's super important for us not to take our eye off the ball with regard to outreach to historically underrepresented groups. And that is an absolute focus for us and one of our metrics of success. For the department to be successful, we absolutely have to have a police force that represents the people that we serve. And so that has been a primary focus for us for years and will remain so. The bonus piece we see being complementary to that effort, not taking the place of any of our current initiatives.
Okay, thank you for that. Your thoughts here. How do you think these bonuses will impact the police department and communities of color locally? I'm trying to figure out if these incentives will attract people of color who are actually from Seattle, who live here and want to stay here. What do you think about that?
I think it's really important what Councilmember González had mentioned about ensuring that we have new recruits from this area. One of the major top-line things that we heard throughout this process and engaging communities in this very important piece was that they wanted folks from their communities. So ensuring that it's not just lateral hires, but also those that are new recruits from the area is super important not to overlook. But again, I'm going to note that it is a short-term strategy, as Councilmember González mentioned. And SPD, one of the things that we noted in our assessment back in 2016 is that SPD has had more diverse, is a more diverse police department than other police departments, and has been doing a lot of work in recruitment of diverse folks. It is the additional training, the strategies, the mentorship that is important to ensure that we are engaging with the community. We can't lose sight of the overall purpose of why more diverse hires are important. They're important because they can improve relationships and decrease negative interactions. And if we consistently train in similar ways, so, some of the things that we heard were more cultural awareness trainings, more training in community, have new recruits or new folks who are starting with the department do more work in community to get to know their communities that they're serving in a non-crisis situation. So oftentimes officers are in crisis, are seeing people in their worst, but the part that was really important to these communities, to know who they were, know their names, and be able to trust them and talk to them and know them in times when they're happy and doing things and going to school and just working day to day. Those things are important with developing relationships. So recruitment and hiring is a short-term strategy, but it's how we continue to engage with the communities that is really important, and why it mattered to communities that they were represented in law enforcement and at SPD.
Thank you, Faye. And Lorena, let me jump into this a little bit, because I think what Faye is talking about, this is a short-term investment, and it's coming from dollars that are already in the SPD to make it happen. But are there ways to change outreach efforts overall for the SPD, get more officers involved in schools? Let me know about some of the different efforts that will help bolster this bonus program, I guess.
Well, I mean, I think I would defer to Mike as the expert in some of those particulars, but I really want to actually focus in, if we can, on some of the longer term strategies that I think need to happen in this space. And so Fez's absolutely right. This is a short term strategy designed to help with the current urgent need of having more people come into the police department to be officers. Part of the work that we're doing here long term is establishing a work group that will include the police department, the city budget office, my office, council, and the mayor's office. And we are going to be looking at long-term strategies to address some of these recruitment issues, but also some of the retention issues that you hear Fed talking about. And I think one of the main pieces of bodies of work that we need to look at is the report that the Community Police Commission has already done in this space that really dove deeply into communities that have historically had negative interactions with officers, to really get a better sense and understanding of how we can have a department that looks like our community, but also who is actually part of our community. Because demographics is not a proxy for good policing and constitutional policing. We need to have people who are not just from our communities, but who understand what that means. And it's hard to do that if you're just clocking in and clocking out.
And Mike, I think this is an important part of how your job is changing, I would say, a little bit. And I'm trying to figure out the techniques, the tactics you're working on. We live in a state where marijuana is legal, and you got to deal with that. You're looking for officers who are younger and older. Tell me about how your job is changing and this overall job of recruitment. It's not just about bonuses here.
No, it's not. It's twofold. One, getting our message out broadly about the great work that SPD does, about the unique opportunities within the department, and giving a realistic assessment of what it means to be an officer in 2019. And to Faye's point, direct face-to-face communication with community is absolutely essential to reach those groups that have been historically underrepresented. I think it's well established that you can advertise, for example, all you want in a community, but if it's not resonating, if it's not real, if they're not seeing folks from that community at events, for example, it'll be less effective. And so it's really a two-pronged approach, getting our message out generally and not losing that personal face-to-face contact with community.
Oh, and it sounds like, too, when you are out in the community, that's where you're getting some of your best ideas for recruiting. Is that right, in terms of that interaction there?
Yeah, absolutely. Our recruiters have thousands of touch points a year, literally, with folks in the community who are prospective applicants, and then seen through the process. And so it's those folks who can really help us and guide us in terms of making those genuine connections.
Okay, thank you for that. Faye, we need to start wrapping up the show, and you folks too. We're going to try to make it down to one last question here. And Faye, I'm going to start with you on this one. This new bonus program for police, They're advertising it right now. It'll be in place officially in early April here, 30 days from when the mayor signed it. What would you tell, what says to you this is or is not a success? What metrics will you be paying attention to with this, please?
Well, I think this is a long-term goal. I don't know that you can note right, off the top of your head, just because we're not trying, at least for the Community Police Commission's perspective, not looking at this to diversify for diversity's sake or have a quota of numbers. We need to know the impact. We need to see community needs to feel like they can trust the SPD, that they're engaging with SPD. And so as it refers to metrics, I think it would be good to get a baseline assessment, like how are folks feeling right now? I mean, go deeply into it, right? And there are a lot of different communities who need to be able to interact in that space and be able to provide that. And then at some point be able to, on a more long-term scale, figure out, how SPD is doing and how they're engaging with communities and how those communities are feeling impacted. Yeah. So it's not going to be a short-term, we're doing excellent, we're going to know in 6 months or a year, right, or even 5 years. This is a long-term strategy. We have got to be in it as a community, not just SPD, not just council, it has to be as a community a long-term effort that we're in it, that we all have buy-in, and that we continue to progress together.
Yeah, thank you for that, Faye. And Mike, I'll head to you next. This really gets to what I thought Reverend Walden brought up in our setup piece there, building strong community connections and staying with them such that people in the community want to join the SPD. Talk to me about how you measure that. I know that's difficult to measure, but there will be some different metrics that you're keeping an eye on too as this goes forward.
Sure, and some of this is very difficult to measure. Certainly we keep track of the demographics of people that we're hiring, but again, that is not a good, or at least a perfect proxy for how we are interacting with community. And so a lot of it's qualitative. It's when someone responds to a call in a community, how are they received? When someone, one of our officers is doing proactive policing in a community, do they know the folks? Can they speak the language? And how are they received? So there's a qualitative and quantitative piece to this.
Okay. Lorena, just to wrap up here, what are you going to be looking at when it comes to measuring how effective these bonuses are, this overall program? Your final thoughts, please.
Well, I think in the short term, it is very much of at this point, a quantity type of a question, right? Like how many officers are identifying, or how many recruits are identifying that the bonus was a motivator for them to come to the police department.
Right.
And we're going to measure that, and our resolution, the ordinance requires that type of data to be collected so that we can have an understanding of whether or not this program will continue. City Council will have to make a decision in our next budget cycle as to whether or not to reauthorize the ongoing offering of these bonuses. And so that data is going to be important to our evaluation of the program.
Okay, and I know there's a lot more work ahead with it. So
tons more work.
All right, thank you both for your feedback. Thank you too, Faye. And we'll see you next time. Thanks very much. We'll be right back.
You need a diverse police department so they can relate to other people.
I think we need actually dedicated people who want to make a difference in the community rather than just get on for a paycheck.
New Orleans is the same problem, right? So you guys are just not paying them enough.
Trying to bribe somebody to come in, that's a short-term fix.
We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattlechannel.org or find us on Facebook and Twitter and give us your feedback. Before we close today, it's time for our weekly CIO poll. Do you believe a new signing bonus will help attract the best police officers to Seattle? Yes, no, or are you undecided? We want to know what you think. Cast your vote and weigh in with your comments at our website, seattlechannel.org/cityinsideout. While you're there, you can watch our programs online anytime. Coming up next time, tackling mental illness in our state. Washington is ranked 28th in the country for access to mental health professionals, but lawmakers are trying to change that. How are they proposing to address the growing epidemic without a bipartisan agreement on how to pay for it? We take a look at some of the bills up for debate in Olympia next time on City Inside Out. I hope you join us.